Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Heidi, starting with Chapter 20, News from Distant Friends. It was the month of May. The clear, warm sunshine lay upon the mountain, which had turned green again. The last snows had disappeared, and the sun had already coaxed many of the flowers to show their bright heads above the grass. Up above, the gay young wind of spring was singing through the fir trees and shaking down the old dark needles to make room for the new bright green ones that were soon to deck out the trees in their spring finery. Higher up still, the great birds went circling round as of old, while the golden sunshine lighted up the grandfather's hut. Heidi was at home again on the mountain, running back and forth in her accustomed way, not knowing which spot was most delightful. Now she stood still to listen to the deep, mysterious voice of the wind as it blew down to her from the mountain summits. It came nearer and gathered strength as it came, till it broke with force against the fir trees, bending and shaking them and seeming to shout for joy, so that she too, though blown about like a feather, felt she must join in the chorus of exulting sounds. Then she would run around again to the sunny space in front of the hut, and seating herself on the ground, would peer closely into the short grass to see how many little flower cups were open or thinking of opening. From the shed at the back came the sound of sawing and chopping, and Heidi listened to it with pleasure, for it was the old familiar sound she had known from the beginning of her life up here. Suddenly she jumped up and ran around, for she must know what her grandfather was doing. In front of the shed door already stood a finished new chair, and a second was in course of construction under the grandfather's skillful hand. "Oh, I know what these are for!" exclaimed Heidi in great glee. "This one is for Grandmama, and the one you are now making is for Clara. And then there will, I suppose, have to be another," continued Heidi with more hesitation in her voice. "Or do you think, Grandfather, that perhaps Miss Rottenmeier will not come with them?" "Well, I cannot say just yet," replied her grandfather, "but it will be safer to make one so that we can offer her a seat if she does." Heidi looked thoughtfully at the plain wooden chair without arms, as if trying to imagine how Miss Rottenmeier and a chair of this sort would suit one another. After a few minutes' contemplation, "Grandfather," she said, shaking her head doubtfully, "I don't think she would be able to sit on that." "Then we will invite her to sit on the beautiful green couch of grass," was her grandfather's quiet rejoinder. While Heidi was pausing to consider what this might be, there sounded from above a whistling, calling, and other sounds which Heidi immediately recognized. She ran out and found herself surrounded by her four-footed friends. They were apparently as pleased as she was to be among the heights again, for they leaped about and bleated for joy, pushing Heidi this way and that, each anxious to express his delight with some sign of affection. But Peter sent them flying to right and left, for he had something to give to Heidi. When he at last got up to her, he handed her a letter. "There!" he exclaimed, leaving the further explanation of the matter to Heidi herself. "Did someone give you this while you were out with the goats?" she asked in surprise. "No," answered Peter briefly. "Where did you get it from, then?" "I found it in the dinner bag." That was true to a certain extent. The letter to Heidi had been given him the evening before by the postman at Dorfley, and Peter had put it into his empty bag. That morning he had stuffed his bread and cheese on top of it and forgotten it when he stopped to get Alm Uncle's 2 goats. When he had finished his bread and cheese at midday and was searching in the bag for last crumbs, he had found the letter which lay at the bottom. Heidi read the address carefully. Then she ran back to the shed, holding out her letter to her grandfather in high glee. "From Frankfurt, from Clara. Would you like to hear it?" The grandfather was ready and pleased to do so, and so was Peter, who had followed Heidi into the shed. "Dearest Heidi, everything is packed, and we shall start now in 2 or 3 days, as soon as Papa himself is ready to leave. He is not coming with us, for he has to go to Paris first. The doctor comes every day, and as soon as he is inside the door, he cries, 'Off now, as quickly as you can, off to the mountain.' He is most impatient about our going. You cannot think how much he enjoyed himself when he was with you. He has called nearly every day this winter, and each time he has come into my room and said he must tell me about everything again. And then he sits down and describes all he did with you and the grandfather, and talks of the mountains and the flowers, and of the great silence up there far above all towns and villages, and of the fresh, delicious air, and often adds, 'No one can help getting well up there.' He himself is quite a different man since his visit, and looks quite young again and happy, which he had not been for a long time before. Oh, how I am looking forward to seeing everything, and to being with you on the mountain, and to making the acquaintance of Peter and the goats. I shall first have to go through a 6 weeks' cure at Regatz, and then we shall move up to Dorfley, and every fine day I shall be carried up the mountain in my chair and spend the day with you. Grandmamma is traveling with me and will remain with me. She also is delighted at the thought of paying you a visit. But just imagine, Miss Rottenmeier refuses to come with us. Almost every day Grandmamma says to her, "Well, how about this Swiss journey, my worthy Rottenmeier? Pray say if you really would like to come with us." But she always thanks Grandmamma very politely and says she has quite made up her mind. I think I know what has done it. Sebastian gave such a frightful description of the mountain, of how the rocks were so overhanging and dangerous that at any minute you might fall into a crevasse, and how it was such steep climbing that you feared at every step to go slipping to the bottom, and that goats alone could make their way up without fear of being killed. She shuddered when she heard him tell of all this, and since then she has not been so enthusiastic about Switzerland as she was before. Tinette is afraid too, and she also refuses to come. So Grandmamma and I will be alone. Sebastian will go with us as far as Regatz, and then return here. I can hardly wait till I see you again. Goodbye, dearest Heidi. Grandmamma sends you her best love and all good wishes. Your affectionate friend, Clara. Peter, as soon as the conclusion of the letter had been reached, rushed out, twirling his stick in the air in such a reckless fashion that the frightened goats fled down the mountain before him with higher and wider leaps than usual. Peter followed at full speed, his stick still raised in the air in a menacing manner as if he was longing to vent his fury on some invisible foe. This foe was indeed the prospect of the arrival of the Frankfurt visitors, the thought of whom filled him with exasperation. The next afternoon Heidi ran down to tell Grandmother her good news. The grandmother sat in her corner at her spinning wheel. There was an expression on her face of mournful anxiety. Peter had come in the evening before, brimful of anger, and had told about the large party that was coming up from Frankfurt, and the old woman was troubled by the thought of Heidi's being taken from her. Heidi began eagerly pouring out all her news, growing more excited with her pleasure as she went on. But all of a sudden she stopped short and said anxiously, "What is the matter, Grandmother? Aren't you a bit pleased with what I am telling you?" "Yes, yes, of course, child, since it gives you so much pleasure," the old woman answered, trying to look more cheerful. "But I can see all the same that something troubles you. Is it because you think after all that Miss Rottenmeier may come?" asked Heidi, beginning to feel anxious herself. "No, no, it is nothing, child," said the grandmother, wishing to reassure her. "Just give me your hand that I may feel sure you are there. No doubt it would be the best thing for you, although I feel I could scarcely survive it." "I do not want anything of the best if you could scarcely survive it," said Heidi in a determined tone of voice. But the grandmother was not comforted. She felt sure the people from Frankfurt were coming to take Heidi back with them since she was well again. But she was anxious to hide her trouble from Heidi if possible. "Heidi," she said, "there is something that would comfort me and calm my thoughts. Read me the hymn beginning, 'All things will work for good.'" Heidi found the place at once and read out in her clear young voice, "All things will work for good to those who trust in me. I come with healing on my wings to save and set thee free." "Yes, yes, that is just what I wanted to hear," said the grandmother, and the deep expression of trouble passed from her face. When the evening came, Heidi returned home up the mountain. The stars came out overhead, one by one, so bright and sparkling that each seemed to send a fresh ray of joy into her heart. She was obliged to pause continually to look up, and as the whole sky at last grew spangled with them, she spoke aloud. "Yes, I understand now why we feel so happy and are not afraid about anything, because God knows what is good and beautiful for us." And the stars with their glistening eyes continued to nod to her till she reached home, where she found her grandfather also standing and looking up at them, for they had seldom been more glorious than they were this night. May passed with everything growing greener and greener, and then came the month of June, with a hotter sun and long light days that brought the flowers out all over the mountain so that every spot was bright with them, and the air full of their sweet scents. This month, too, was drawing to its close, when one day Heidi, having finished her household duties, came running out of the hut. Suddenly she gave such a loud cry that her grandfather hurried out of the shed to see what had happened. "Grandfather, grandfather!" she cried, she cried, beside herself with excitement. "Come here! Look, look!" A strange-looking procession was making its way up the mountain. In front were two men carrying a sedan chair, in which sat a girl well wrapped up in shawls. Then followed a horse mounted by a stately lady who was looking about her with great interest and talking to the guide who walked beside her. Then came a rolling chair which was being pushed up by another man. Last in the procession came a porter with such a bundle of cloaks, shawls, and furs on his back that it rose well above his head. "Here they come! Here they come!" shouted Heidi, jumping with joy. Soon the party reached the top. The men in front put down their burden. Heidi rushed forward, and the two children embraced each other delightedly. Grandmamma dismounted and gave Heidi an affectionate greeting before turning to the grandfather, who had meanwhile come up to welcome his guests. There was no constraint about the meeting, for they knew each other perfectly well from hearsay and felt like old acquaintances. After the first words of greeting had been exchanged, Grandmamma broke out into lively expressions of admiration. "What a magnificent place you have to live in, Uncle! I could hardly have believed it was so beautiful. A king might well envy it. And how well my little Heidi looks, like a wild rose," she continued, drawing the child toward her and stroking her fresh pink cheeks. "I don't know which way to look first. It is all so lovely. What do you say to it, Clara? What do you say?" Clara was gazing round entranced. She had never imagined, much less seen, anything so beautiful. She gave vent to her delight in cries of joy. "Oh, Grandmamma," she said, "I should like to remain here forever." The grandfather had meanwhile drawn up the invalid chair and spread some of the wraps over it. He now went up to Clara. "Suppose we carry the little daughter to her accustomed chair. I think she will be more comfortable, for the traveling sedan is rather hard," he said, and without waiting for anyone to help him, he lifted the child in his strong arms and laid her gently down in her own chair. Then he covered her over carefully and arranged her feet on the soft cushion, as if he had never done anything all his life but wait on cripples. The grandmamma looked on with surprise. "My dear uncle," she exclaimed, "if I knew where you had learned to nurse, I would at once send all the nurses I know to the same place, that they might handle their patients as you do." "I know more from experience than training," he answered. The sky spread blue and cloudless over the hut, and the fir trees and far above over the high rocks, the gray summits of which glistened in the sun. Clara could not feast her eyes enough on all the beauty around her. "Oh, Heidi, if only I could walk about with you," she said longingly. "If I could only go and look at the fir trees. I want to see everything you have told me about." Heidi, in response, put out all her strength and after a slight effort managed to wheel Clara's chair quite easily around the hut to the fir trees. There they paused. Clara had never seen such trees before, with their tall, straight stems and long, thick branches growing thicker and thicker till they touched the ground. Even the grandmamma who had followed the children was astonished at the sight of them. Heidi had now wheeled Clara onto the goat shed and had flung open the door so that Clara might have a full view of all that was inside. There was not much to see just now, since the goats were absent. Clara lamented to her grandmother that they would have to leave early before the goats came home. "I should so like to see Peter and his whole flock," she said regretfully. "Dear child, let us enjoy all the beautiful things that we can see and not think about those that we cannot," Grandmamma replied as she followed the chair which Heidi was pushing farther on. "Oh, the flowers!" exclaimed Clara. "Look at the bushes of red flowers and all the nodding bluebells. Oh, if I could but get out and pick some." Heidi ran off at once and picked her a large bunch of them. "But these are nothing, Clara," she said, laying the flowers on her lap. "If you could come up higher to where the goats are feeding, then you would indeed see something. Bushes on bushes of the red centaury, and ever so many more of the blue bellflowers, and then the bright yellow rock roses that gleam like pure gold, and all crowding together in the one spot. And then there are others with the large leaves that Grandfather calls bright eyes, and the brown ones with the little round heads that smell so delicious. Oh, it is beautiful up there, and if you sit down among them, you never want to get up again. Everything looks and smells so lovely." Heidi's eyes sparkled with the remembrance of what she was describing. She was longing herself to see it all again, and Clara caught her enthusiasm and looked back at her with equal longing in her soft blue eyes. "Grandmamma, do you think I could get up there? Is it possible for me to go?" she asked eagerly. "If only I could walk, climb about everywhere with you, Heidi." "I am sure I could push you up. The chair goes so easily," said Heidi. And in proof of her words, she sent the chair at such a pace round the corner that if Grandmamma had not been near to stop it, it might have gone flying down the mountainside. The grandfather, meantime, had not been idle. He had by this time put the table and extra chairs in front of the seat so that they might all sit out here and eat the dinner that was preparing inside. The milk and the cheese were soon ready, and then the company sat down in high spirits to their midday meal. Grandmamma was enchanted, as the doctor had been, with their dining room, from which one could see far along the valley and far over the mountains to the distant stretch of blue sky. A light wind blew refreshingly over them as they sat at table, and the rustling of the fir trees made a festive accompaniment to the meal. "I have never enjoyed anything as much as this. It is really superb," cried Grandmamma 2 or 3 times over. Suddenly, she exclaimed in a tone of surprise, "Do I really see you taking a second piece of toasted cheese, Clara?" There, sure enough, was a second golden-colored slice of cheese on Clara's plate. "Oh, it does taste so good, Grandmamma, better than all the dishes we have at Ragatz," replied Clara as she continued eating with appetite. "That's right, eat what you can," exclaimed Uncle. "It's the mountain air which makes up for the deficiencies of the kitchen." And so the meal went on. Grandmamma and Uncle got on very well together, and their conversation became more and more lively. They were so thoroughly agreed in their opinions of men and things and the world in general that they might have been taken for old cronies. The time passed merrily, and then Grandmamma looked toward the west and said, "We must soon get ready to go, Clara. The sun is a good way down. The men will be here presently with the horse and sedan." Clara's face fell, and she said beseechingly, "Oh, just another hour, Grandmamma, or 2 hours. We haven't seen inside the hut yet, or Heidi's bed, or any of the other things. If only the day were 10 hours long." "Well, that is not possible," said Grandmamma, but she herself was anxious to see inside the hut, so they all rose from the table, and Uncle wheeled Clara's chair to the door. There they came to a standstill, for the chair was much too broad to pass through the door. Uncle, however, soon settled the difficulty by lifting Clara in his strong arms and carrying her inside. Grandmamma went all around and examined the household arrangements and was very much amused and pleased at their orderliness and the cozy appearance of everything. "And this is your bedroom up here, Heidi, is it not?" she asked, as without hesitation she mounted the ladder to the hayloft. "Oh, it does smell sweet. What a healthful place to sleep in." She went up to the round window and looked out. Grandfather followed with Clara in his arms, Heidi springing up after them. Then they all stood and examined Heidi's wonderful hay bed, and Grandmamma looked thoughtfully at it and drew in from time to time fragrant draughts of the hay-perfumed air. Clara was charmed beyond words with Heidi's sleeping apartment. "It is delightful for you up here, Heidi. You can look from your bed straight into the sky, and there is such a delicious smell all around you. And outside, the fir trees are waving and rustling. I have never seen such a pleasant, cheerful bedroom before." Uncle looked across at Grandmamma. "I have been thinking," he said to her, "that if you were willing to agree to it, your little granddaughter might remain up here, and I am sure she would grow stronger. You have brought up all kinds of shawls and covers with you, and we could make up a soft bed out of them. You need have no fear about Clara. I will be glad to look after her." Clara and Heidi were overjoyed at these words, and Grandmamma's face beamed with satisfaction. "You are indeed kind, my dear uncle," she exclaimed. "You give words to the thought that was in my own mind. I was only asking myself whether a stay up here might not be the very thing she wanted. But then the trouble, the inconvenience to yourself, and you speak of nursing and looking after her as if it were a mere nothing. I thank you sincerely. I thank you from my whole heart, Uncle." Uncle carried Clara back to her chair outside, and Heidi followed, not knowing how to jump high enough into the air to express her contentment. Together, Uncle and Grandmamma made up a soft bed for Clara close beside Heidi's. When the children were told that Clara was to stay for a month, they clapped their hands for joy, for they had not expected to be together for so long a time. The bearers and the horse and guide were now seen approaching, and Grandmamma prepared to mount for her return journey. "It's not saying goodbye, Grandmamma," Clara called out, "for you will come up now and then and see how we are getting on, and we shall so look forward to your visits, shan't we, Heidi?" Heidi, who felt that life this day had been crowded with pleasures, could only respond to Clara with another jump of joy. Grandmamma was now seated on her sturdy animal, and Uncle took the bridle to lead her down the steep mountain path. She begged him not to come far with her, but he insisted on seeing her safely as far as Dorfli, for the way was steep and not without danger for the rider, he said. Grandmamma did not care to stay alone in Dorfli, and therefore decided to return to Ragatz, and from there to make excursions up the mountain from time to time. Peter came down with his goats before Uncle had returned. As soon as the animals caught sight of Heidi, they all came flocking toward her, and she and Clara on her chair were soon surrounded by the goats. They pushed and poked their heads over one another, while Heidi introduced each in turn by its name to her friend. Peter, meanwhile, stood looking on and casting somewhat unfriendly glances toward Clara. When the two children called out, "Good evening, Peter," he made no answer, but swung up his stick angrily, as if he wanted to cut the air in two, and then ran off with his goats after him. The climax to all the beautiful things that Clara had already seen upon the mountain came at the close of the day. As she lay on the large, soft bed in the hayloft with Heidi near her, she looked out through the round open window right into the middle of the shining cluster of stars. "Heidi," she exclaimed in delight, "it is just as if we were in a high carriage and were going to drive straight into heaven." "Yes, and do you know why the stars are so happy and look down and nod to us like that?" asked Heidi. "No, why is it?" Clara asked in return. "Because they live up in heaven and know how well God arranges everything for us, so that we need have no more fear or trouble and may be quite sure that all things will come right in the end. That's why they are so happy, and they nod to us because they want us to be happy too. But then we must never forget to pray and to ask God to remember us when He is arranging things, so that we too may feel safe and not be afraid about what is going to happen." The two children now sat up and said their prayers, and then Heidi put her head down on her little round arm and fell off to sleep at once. But Clara lay awake some time. She could not get over the wonder of this new experience of being in bed up here among the stars. She had indeed seldom seen a star, for she never went outside the house at night, and the curtains at home were always drawn before the stars came out. Each time she closed her eyes, she felt she must open them again to see if the two very large stars were still looking in and nodding to her as Heidi said they did. There they were, always in the same place. Clara felt she could not look long enough into their bright, sparkling faces, until at last her eyes closed of their own accord, and it was only in her dreams that she still saw the two large, friendly stars shining down upon her. We'll stop there today and start tomorrow with Chapter 21. Thank you. Bye-bye.